He whined hit me like a slap, bitterly cold. I stumbled out from the snow-laden pine trees, my bare feet bleeding across the frozen grass. My dress was torn, my face crusted with dirt-dried blood and tears. I limped down the slope toward the squat little ranch house, smoke curling from the chimney, a horse tied to the post out front. I could barely lift my head, but my voice scraped out anyway, raw and hoarse. I'm dirty, poor, and barely alive. The man on the porch hadn't moved yet. He sat still, elbows on his knees, a battered hat shadowing his eyes. After a long second, he stood and walked down the steps, stopping just a few feet from me. His voice was quiet, steady. So was I once. Come inside. I collapsed before I could answer. I woke to the smell of wood smoke and something warm against my cheek, a blanket. I blinked against the dim light, my whole body aching. My arms were scraped, my ribs were bruised, but I was alive and inside. The man was kneeling by the hearth, stirring a pot. He turned his head slightly. You awake? I nodded, my throat tight. He stood and brought me a tin cup of warm water. I reached for it with shaking hands, but he helped me hold it steady. Name's Julian Cooper. Elara, I whispered. Elara Stone. He nodded once and sat back. He was tall with a rough edge to his features, his jaw unshaven, his eyes the color of creekstone. His shirt was patched, his hands calloused, and he moved like someone who had worked himself into the ground more than once. How long you been out there? He asked. I shook my head. I don't know. Days, maybe more. He waited. I was with a wagon train south of here. We were headed toward Riverton. Got jumped by bandits. I think everything went to hell. My jaw locked with grief. Anyone else get away? I blinked hard, the pain a physical thing. No, I ran. I kept running. He nodded again, no pity in his face. Just understanding. The next morning I sat on the edge of the porch, wrapped in his old wool coat. My feet were bandaged. My hair was clean now, damp against my neck. Julian had not asked questions he did not need answers to. He had let me sleep, fed me, and given me the little he had. He stepped outside with 2 mugs and handed me one. I looked at him. Why did you take me in? He sat beside me. Because someone once did the same for me. I watched the sunrise creep over the prairie, gold light brushing the frost from the grass. I used to be a seamstress, I said. Back in Ohio, my brother had a farm. After he died, I had nothing, so I came west. He looked at me. You married? No, I said quickly. Never. He nodded and sipped his coffee. I looked down at the mug in my hands. You once? I asked. Long time ago. What happened? She died. Neither of us spoke for a while. Underscore. Over the next few days, I found my legs again. I helped where I could, mending a broken hinge on the chicken coop, washing dishes beside the pump, folding laundry in the sun. Julian did not hover, but he noticed. Do you see? He'd ask. I would nod. He handed me a torn shirt one evening. That one's been waiting a year. I smiled a little. I can do better than that. I fixed it by lantern light while he read a newspaper at the table. His eyes kept drifting over to me, though he said nothing. That night I lay on the cot he had set up in the corner of the single-room cabin, listening to the wind outside and the soft creak of his boots as he moved about. I felt warm for the first time in weeks. One morning I found him in the barn brushing down the mare. You always live alone? I asked. He looked at me over the horse's back. Not always. Just got used to it. I don't want to be a burden, I said. You are not. I'm not sure where to go, I admitted. You do not have to go, he said it quiet, like it was not a decision made just now, but something he had already accepted. I stepped closer. I do not have anything to offer. He turned. You are alive. That is more than enough. I held his gaze. My cheeks flushed, but I did not look away. Thank you, I said. He nodded. You are welcome to stay as long as you want. The days passed with a soft rhythm. I learned the land around the cabin, where the creek curved, where the rabbits nested. I baked bread. I mended his shirts. I stitched a new curtain for the lone window. When the first snow fell, I stood at the door and watched it, my breath fogging the glass. Julian came up beside me. You ever seen Wyoming in winter? I only just survived autumn, I replied. He smiled, quiet and warm. That night we sat by the fire closer than usual. My foot brushed his. I did not pull away. Neither did he. I never thought I would feel safe again, I said. I never thought I would care again, he replied. I turned to him. You do? He met my eyes. Yeah, I do. I reached out slowly and took his hand. He laced his fingers through mine. Later that night, when I laid my head against his shoulder, he wrapped his arm around me without hesitation. The firelight danced across the floor, and outside the wind howled across the plains. Inside we did not speak. We did not need to. I closed my eyes, my heart steady for the first time in a long while, and he held me there like he had no intention of ever letting go. The wind had settled by morning, leaving a brittle silence across the snow-covered ridge. I opened the barn door with both hands, careful not to wake the chickens roosting high in the rafters. My boots rough and worn, but mine now crunched lightly over the straw. The mare turned her head, ears flicking toward me. "She trusts you quicker than she did me," Julian said, from the stall beside her, his breath forming clouds in the cold. "She knows I won't make her pull anything heavier than she needs to," I said. "Same deal I'd offer anyone." He leaned on the post, watching me rub the mare's neck with slow, practiced care. "You treat everything like it's got a soul. If it can hurt, it does." He didn't answer right away. He just stepped back and fetched the feed bucket. When he handed it to me, our fingers brushed, and neither of us pulled away. "I've been thinking about the south fence line," he said. "Couple posts rotted straight through. Snow will drop it clean if we let it." "I can help," I said. "You're not swinging a maul with those wrists. I can carry rails or brace the line while you dig. There's more than one way to mend a place." He studied my face, the quiet resolve in it. "All right then." We worked until mid-afternoon, our breath rising in plumes as we moved along the slope behind the barn. I held the line steady while he drove the spade into the frozen earth, his shoulders taut. When he paused to wipe his brow, I handed him the fresh rail without being asked. Our rhythm grew steady, unspoken. "You always this stubborn?" he asked, driving the post in. "You always this surprised when someone keeps pace?" He gave a low chuckle, the sound rare and unguarded. That night, Julian laid a second log on the hearth and sat beside me at the table where I was darning one of the wool socks I'd found tucked in an old chest. "You ever miss where you were before?" he asked. "No," I said, threading the needle. "The people, yes. But not the place." He nodded, waiting. My brother was a quiet man, but he always said land should be lived on, not just owned. Ohio felt like it belonged to someone else. Out here, I glanced toward the dark window. "It feels like it's waiting." "I used to think the same," he said. "But after I buried Clara, I didn't see the point in waiting for anything." I set the sock down. "What changed?" He didn't look at me right away. "You walked out of the trees." The room went still. The fire crackled. I didn't speak, but my hands slid across the table, resting near his, not touching, just near enough to choose. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the kettle warming on the stove and the scent of corn mush. My coat was hanging by the door, mended. I ran my hand over the stitching at the shoulder. It wasn't my work. He looked up when I stepped into the room. "Wasn't right you wearing it with the seam torn." "I did this. Best I could." I smiled, not wide, just enough to soften the edges of my face. "Good hands." He stirred the pot, his jaw working. "I was thinking when spring comes I'll need to ride into town resupply." "I could come," I said. "If you wanted. I'd like that." I sat across from him, folding my hands. "Well, they'll ask questions. They'll look, but they'll stop once they see I'm not letting you go." I met his gaze. "You wouldn't." "No," he said. "I wouldn't." That evening, as snow began to fall again, I stood outside the barn and looked out over the hills, the sky pale with dusk. Julian joined me, coat open, hat low. "You ever think about leaving this place?" I asked. "Once. And now I've got a reason to stay." I looked at him, my eyes steady. "So do I." He reached for my hand this time, and I let him take it, our fingers laced in the hush of the gathering dark. No declarations, just the quiet certainty of two people who had stopped running. The wind picked up again, but it was softer now, curling around us like something settling into place. The snow held through the week, thinning the clouds but thickening the hush over the land. Each morning I rose before the light edged the horizon and walked to the shed to gather kindling. My limbs still carried the ache of healing, but they moved with quiet purpose now. By the sixth day, the sky cleared fully, and sunlight spilled gold across the frozen ground. Julian had gone to check the traps along the creek, and I was alone on the porch mending a set of reins stiff with old wear. A hawk passed overhead, silent but sure, and I paused to watch it drift. When Julian returned, he carried a small leather pouch tied shut at the top. "Found this tucked behind a rock out near Sand Bluff," he said, setting the pouch on the table inside. "Wasn't mine." I opened it carefully. Inside were buttons, bone brass, and one carved from antler, and a thimble worn smooth. I ran my thumb over the antler one. Think someone lost it or left it behind on purpose. I traced the edge of the thimble. I had a sewing box before. It rattled like this when I walked. "You want to keep it?" I nodded once. "I do." He started preparing the rabbit while I filled the pot with water. The silence between us was full, not hollow, something shaped by presence, not absence. As the stew simmered, Julian sat down and leaned back in the chair, resting his ankle over his knee. I brought my stool over, setting it beside him with a quiet scrape. "I never asked what you did before," I said. "Before this place, drove cattle. Arizona, then up through Kansas. Took a bullet in the shoulder near Abilene. After that I drifted. Found this land through a man I met in Laramie. He'd lost interest in it. I hadn't yet. Do you ever want to leave it behind?" "No," he said, "but I wouldn't mind someone else knowing it like I do." I looked down at my hands. "It takes time to learn a place. You've already started." Later that night, as the wind settled into a low sigh against the eaves, I stood by the stove drying my hands. Julian had fallen quiet again, his gaze drawn toward the window, though there was nothing to see but darkness and the faint reflection of the lamp. "I dreamed last night," I said. "First time since I got here." He turned slightly. "What of my brother?" He was standing at the edge of a field. He didn't speak, just looked at me like he was making sure I was all right. "Were you? I think so." He reached for the poker, adjusting the logs. "I used to dream of Clara after she passed. She'd be by the fence brushing her hair, never turned around. Did it get easier? Number? But it got gentler." They didn't speak again for a while. The fire snapped softly, and the old clock on the shelf ticked steady and slow. When I moved to the cot, he didn't say goodnight, just met my eyes and held them for a long breath. I lay awake long after the flame burned low, listening to the rhythm of the wind and the creak of the house. My body was tired, but my mind was quiet. In the morning, I found Julian outside hammering something to the barn wall. I stepped closer, brushing snow off my sleeves. He stood back, arms crossed. "Figured we could use a bell out here if you ever needed something." And I was up the hill. I looked at the small iron bell hung beneath the roofline. "You thought of that for me, seemed right." I reached up and touched the rope. The bell gave a soft chime, low and clear. "I'll ring it if I need you," I said. "I'll hear it," he replied. That night I didn't return to the cot. I waited beside the fire until he finished closing up the barn. When he stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders, I stood. "I don't want to sleep in a corner anymore," I said. He didn't move. I took a step forward. "I want to sleep beside the man who pulled me from the dark and never asked me to earn it." Still he waited, "And I want to wake up knowing I'm not going to be sent away." He crossed the room in 3 strides and took my hands in his. "You won't be." Our foreheads touched, breath shared in the warmth of the cabin. No promises were spoken. They weren't needed. We would build the rest slowly, with hands and time, with each stitch and fence post, each winter morning and spring thaw. And when dawn came, it found us together, no longer running, no longer alone. The thaw came slow, carving narrow channels through the snowpack that lined the edge of the pasture. Mud clung to the wagon wheels, and the air held the scent of damp earth and pine bark. I sat on the flat stone near the well, mending the worn strap of a saddlebag with steady hands. My cheeks had taken on color again, not from cold, but from sun, and a few loose strands of hair drifted across my brow in the breeze. Julian came up from the creek trail, leading a pack mule heavy with cut firewood. He didn't call out, just let the quiet settle between us before dropping the lead rope and crouching beside the tool bench. "New saddlebag?" he asked, unscrewing the cap off a tin of polish. "Yours," I said. The stitching was tearing near the buckle. "Figured it'd split clean if you rode out again." He glanced at my hands. "You always notice what's fraying." I tied off the thread. "It's habit. You learn to look ahead if you don't want things falling apart in your hands." He stood and set the polish aside. "I found something in the east field. Might be old fencing. Could use another set of eyes." I followed him past the barn and down the slope, the wet ground soft underfoot. Near the edge of the property, half buried under moss and wind-blown pine needles, lay a rotted length of timber with rusted nails bent sideways at the base. "You think someone fenced this land before you?" I asked. "Could have been a miner or someone passing through, hard to say." I crouched, brushing away debris. "There's charcoal in the dirt. Someone burned something here. Maybe a brush pile. Maybe something else." "Does it matter?" He looked out over the hills. "No, but it reminds me this place wasn't always mine." I stood and touched his arm. "It is now." That night rain came in steady sheets. I stood at the window, the lantern glow casting my shadow long across the floor. Julian sat nearby, sharpening a blade with slow, even strokes. I didn't turn when I spoke. "What happened to your shoulder?" He paused. "A cattle drive went bad. We were crossing land the locals didn't want us on. One of them put a rifle on me. Bullet passed through, but it laid me open. You stayed down long." Long enough to know I wasn't invincible. I faced him. Is that when you stopped riding? No, I kept going. But that's when I stopped following someone else's trail. I crossed the room and sat on the floor beside his chair, my knees tucked close. What would you have been if not a cattleman, he considered it. Maybe a map maker. I like knowing what's ahead, and what's hiding in the folds. I smiled faintly. I used to draw with charcoal on the backs of bread paper. Dresses I'd never make. Houses I'd never live in. You're living in one now. I know. That's the strange part. Thunder rolled a low growl across the plains. We sat without speaking for a time, the blade forgotten in his lap, the rain tapping steady against the roof. In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air sharp with the scent of wet grass and pine resin. I came back from the henhouse with a basket of eggs, my boots caked in mud. Julian was splitting kindling under the lean-to sleeves rolled to his elbows, sweat streaking the dust on his arms. I set the basket down and leaned beside the doorway. You ever think about building on he didn't stop swinging? What you have in mind? A second room, maybe a loft. Planning ahead, I folded my arms. I was thinking of a garden and a table that doesn't wobble when someone leans on it. He set the axe aside and wiped his brow. Sounds like you're staying. I stepped toward him. I am. He didn't touch me. Not yet. But he looked at me like the ground beneath his feet had settled for the first time in years. That night he brought me a folded square of paper. On it, rough lines drawn in pencil, a sketch of the cabin, and beside it a second room shaded in. I'm no draftsman, he said, but I thought we could start here. I ran my fingers along the lines. You left space for a porch. Thought you might want one. I looked up at him. You were right. We stood close in the lamplight, neither speaking. The wind was quiet. The fire burned low, and between us was something built not with haste, but with care, with each day, added like a beam, each moment laid like a stone. I reached for his hand, and this time he met me halfway. _ The hammering began before the frost had left the grass, a steady rhythm that echoed through the trees beyond the ridge. I stood beside the new timber frame, measuring plank length by eye, while Julian drove pegs into the joists. Sawdust clung to the hem of my skirt. I set the next board against the wall and held it steady with my shoulder, while he climbed the ladder. You think it'll hold? I asked. It'll hold, he said. You square it better than I ever did. I stepped back, brushing my palms together. Can't sew rafters, but I can line up a corner. He glanced down at me, grinning beneath the brim of his hat. Makes me think you were meant to be out here. I wasn't meant for anything, I said, picking up the next beam. But I'm learning what suits me. The walls of the new room took shape, slow and deliberate. Every board was paid for with sweat and patience. I had taken to drawing marks on the inside, joist tiny notches, one for each day we worked side by side. I didn't tell him. Not yet. It wasn't for counting time. It was for keeping it. By early summer, the grasses had risen waist-high in the far pasture, and the wildflowers pressed across the lower field in a slow bloom of color. I stood at the edge of the new room, the floorboards warm beneath my bare feet, and wiped my wrist across my brow. Julian was splitting cedar planks for the porch rail. He paused when he saw me watching him. You ever think about marrying again? I asked. He let the maul fall back against his shoulders. I do now. I stepped down, boots in hand. You haven't asked. I didn't want to press you. I wouldn't be standing here if you had. He set the draw knife aside and wiped his hands on his trousers. Would you say yes if I'm asking? He walked toward me slow and sure until we stood so close. The air between us felt like breath held still. I've got no preacher, no ring, and no fine words, he said. You've got me, I said. That's enough. We married beside the creek 3 days later. Mrs. Elkins, the widow from 4 homesteads west, came to witness. Her son carved a small cross from pine and fastened it into the soil with a stone. The preacher rode up from Medicine Bow and said the words over the sound of water moving downstream. I wore the blue calico I'd stitched myself. Julian wore the shirt I'd mended that first week, the one with the patched shoulder. After we shared bread and dried apples beneath the cottonwoods, the sun warming our backs, and when Julian took my hand in his, neither of us let go for the rest of the day. The seasons turned again. The porch took shape and I filled it with drying herbs, clay pots, and a small wooden bench he'd carved for me. I started a garden by the shed, beans, onions, and turnips. When Julian rode into town, I came with him. We bought a second horse, gentler, for me and named him Alder. One morning I found Julian standing at the back of the property looking out toward the hills where the grass met the sky. You think we'll stay? I asked. He nodded slow. There's nothing past that rise I need anymore. I touched his arm. I never thought I'd belong to a place again. It's not the place, he said. It's who's in it. That night, we sat on the porch with coffee in tin mugs, the stars opening wide above us. He reached for my hand, his fingers warm and calloused against mine. I keep thinking about what we've built, he said. This house, this life. It's ours, I said. Every morning he tilted his head toward me. You happy? I looked at him, my eyes steady. I am. I didn't know I could be, but I am. He leaned down and kissed me slow, sure, and quiet. My hand came to rest against his chest where his heartbeat moved steady beneath my palm. We stayed like that long after the fire burned down, the night folding soft around us, the fields breathing cool and full. Years passed. The cabin grew weathered but strong. The porch rail smoothed under our hands. The garden stretched wider. Julian built a small table for drying roots, and I began pressing herbs between cloth pages, labeling each with ink I made from boiled walnut husks. Children never came, but we didn't need them. We had the land, the seasons, and each other. We read aloud in the evenings, traded goods with neighbors, and rode into town once each month for supplies and quiet conversation over coffee at the mercantile. We kept the old cot in the corner, though no one used it. It was a reminder not of sorrow, but of beginning. Sometimes I would still wake in the dark and listen for the wind, but it was never the same wind that chased me through the trees. This one was gentler. It wrapped around the eaves like a lullaby, and I would turn toward Julian, warm beside me, and press my face into the crook of his neck. He always stirred just enough to pull me close, and we slept through the night, two people who had found in each other not rescue but home. The story of Alara and Julian shows us that redemption often comes not from grand gestures, but from small, genuine acts of kindness. In life, we all face moments of exhaustion, loss, and uncertainty, times when it feels impossible to stand back up. In those moments, an outstretched hand without conditions, a warm place to rest, or simply the quiet presence of someone who cares, can be the anchor that restores our faith. Their bond was built through simple, everyday acts: fixing fences, mending shirts, sharing a humble meal. Things that may seem small but are stronger than any spoken promise. It's a reminder that happiness doesn't always come from wealth or distant adventures, but from finding a place and a person where we truly belong. For those who have lived through many seasons of change, this lesson is even more precious. Open your heart when you have the chance to help, because sometimes in saving someone else, we also find our own healing. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.